Hey everyone, so as part of the current video I'm working on for the main channel, which is a deep dive into the modern history of the X-Men and the significance and legacy of Jonathan Hickman's House of X, I sat down and recorded an interview last week with Dave Buseing, the founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. Dave is a lifelong X-Men fan and an expert on all things comics, and he and I had a fascinating conversation about the state of X-Men comics throughout the late 2000s and 2010s, Hickman's career and wider work at Marvel, and the success of House of X and Powers of 10, and how these two books relaunched the X-Men and revitalised interest in the series. Now, due to the main video taking a little bit longer than expected to make, I thought I'd share a segment of our conversation here for you to enjoy. If you like this clip, the full interview is available to watch right now at patreon.com/Owen Likes Comics. If you sign up for just £1 a month, you get access to that along with early access to all my main videos. I'll leave a link to that and all of Dave's social links in the description. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation about House of X and Powers of 10 between myself and Dave from Comic Book Herald. You know, I've been reading comics and I've been collecting comics since the first kind of big Marvel event I remember reading was House of M. I kind of caught the end of Disassembled. Like my gateway into like wider Marvel stuff was Bendis's New Avengers. And so that kind of leading out of Disassembled into New Avengers, into House of M and Civil War, that was kind of like my period of really getting into reading Marvel. I'd been reading DC for a few years prior to that, but kind of learning like the wider Marvel universe, like the mid 2000s was kind of my entry point to that. So at that point, I'd kind of been reading comics for close to 15 years and regularly collecting and buying books and having pull lists and all that kind of things. And I still, to this day, thinking about kind of my entire history, my entire lifetime as a comic fan and a comic collector, I have never been so excited for the new issue of a series than when House of X and Powers of 10 were coming out. And I've, like you said, I've never felt the fervor, whether that be online, whether that be in comic shops or just kind of in general comic spaces. I've never seen so much kind of hype and anticipation for a series like Hoxpox. And I think part of that is just because of, like we talked about, Hickman's kind of how established he was as a writer by 2019. The fact that not only had he gone and honed his skills on these great creator-owned projects, but he completely launched himself into superstardom with his Avengers run, you know, going into Infinity, Time Runs Out, Secret Wars. You could make an argument that by kind of 2019, he probably was one of, if not the biggest name in the comic book industry, or at least kind of the newest big name to come about since like Bendis and Fraction and guys like that a kind of decade earlier. So it kind of felt like a perfect storm of like the X-Men by 2019 felt like it had run out of steam and needed a relaunch, and Hickman was kind of ready to step back into another kind of long-term project.
Yeah.
So thinking about the kind of original House of X and Powers of 10 run, we'll kind of keep it limited to that, though I am interested in hearing your kind of broader thoughts on the more kind of collaborative era of Krakoa's X-Men, kind of once we spin out of that into Dawn of X, X of Swords and onwards, where it becomes kind of less like a singular vision from Hickman and more of a collaborative process. But just thinking about this mini-series in particular, how successful do you think it is at kind of relaunching the X-Men, of establishing a new status quo? How do you think it fits in with kind of the recurring themes and the wider body of work that Hickman's written throughout his career? And what were your experiences reading the series kind of as a long-term X fan that was kind of in the hunt for a new, fresh interpretation of the characters?
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely for me, I absolutely loved the series. I think House and Powers is truly fantastic. What I was hungriest for were two things. One that I knew was vision and direction for the X-Men. And this comes out with that in spades, right? It's like, this is going to be the Krakoa era. We are on Krakoa. All mutants belong here. We have conquered death. We have resurrection protocols now. Mutant kind can live forever. The second thing that I was hungry for that I didn't know I needed was, oh, also, this is going to be heavy science fiction. It is going to extend 100 years in the future, no, 1,000 years in the future, and it is going to drop concepts on you like galactic intelligences and all of these things that I still don't fully understand, but data pages full of like, you know, master's degree, doctorate degree textbooks, right, on how this stuff should work. That was so thrilling and appetizing. And it just gave the sense that this could go forever. It gave the sense that like we are in for an instant classic that is going to whet our X appetites for years to come. You could just feel that, and you could feel the excitement of X-Men fans who'd been craving that. Because like I said, you get these little bites and morsels here and there, but there was no substantive, oh, all of X-Men has the potential to be great kind of feeling until this launched. So it worked for me tremendously well. I think the knocks on it that I think you could make and that some people make are the characterizations feel maybe off or strange to some folks, which is part, I think, how Hickman writes. He writes everybody like a philosopher king a lot of times in these, they all talk in these witticisms and clipped dialogue, and sometimes that doesn't feel as personal. And the other criticism was like, well, Professor X feels evil. He feels sinister, right? Which I don't think was unintentional. I don't think that was unintentional. You have a utopian ideal. It's good to set up some mystery and some undercurrent of, well, what is actually going on here under the surface? And that's something that has been played with since. So I actually think, I mean, one of the absolute hardest things you can do in Big Two comics these days is relaunch a franchise without a hard reboot. It is so flippin' hard to pull off and to make it a jumping on point. And is House of X and Powers better if you know history of X-Men comics? Yes, definitely. Is it pretty like accessible and able to jump in if you haven't been keeping up? Yeah, it is. Like if you're a new reader, you're not going to find better jumping on points, you know, at this point in Marvel, again, without an Ultimate Universe style reboot. So I think the fact that it was able to pull that off and tell what is in and of itself a very satisfying 12-issue story, incredible work. I love this book.
Yeah, I think that this is something I was thinking about earlier, which is that how accessible House and Powers of 10 is to people that either have never read X-Men before or haven't read X-Men kind of throughout this lost decade era. And it's funny because like I hadn't been reading X-Men massively for a few years at that point. Yeah. So when I opened the first page of House of X issue 1 and Charles is there dressed like the Maker and the X-Men are coming out of these weird like Matrix goo pods, I have no idea what's happening. Right. But for you that might have read like the previous issues of the previous X-Men books that had just been cancelled, you also would have no idea what's happening either. So it's like it's a very confusing, and like House and Powers work, I think, really well as a mystery in which you're thrown into this status quo, which is unlike anything we'd ever really seen in X-Men. And then throughout the next kind of 10 and 12 issues, they unravel and explain everything. And by the end of the series, you get a full idea of, okay, here is what the world of the X-Men is now. But when you start that series, I think you'd be just as confused if you were as a new reader as if you've read every single X-Men comic since Chris Claremont in 1975. And I think that's by design. Right. I think it works best as a kind of long-running mystery that's slowly unraveled throughout the miniseries and then has continued to be unraveled from Dawn of X all the way into Inferno. You know, you're talking about kind of Xavier's sinister undertones. And, you know, there's a whole bit where Moira talks about like fearing breaking Charles. I think that's a very intentional thing and this idea of like this utopian society built on lies and built on misinformation and mistrust is embedded at the DNA very much from the first issue of House of X and culminates in Hickman's final storyline at the end of Inferno. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this is thematically, it's a utopia story, right? It's a story about, okay, if mutant kind could build their perfect society and live on Earth, what would it look like? How would they get there? What it does very smartly is something you alluded to there, is it jumps ahead in time. It gains separation, both continuity-wise, but just narratively, from where X-Men comics were, right? This is something new. This is something different. We don't have to connect the dots between Professor X coming back in Phantom X's body with the Shadow King and an astonishing X-Men run. We don't have to explain that stuff necessarily, right? He's here, he's walking, he's wearing a Maker helmet. Let's move on, right? What's going to happen from there is what's interesting. So it very wisely jumps ahead. And then that leaves you with questions. That leaves with exciting things to theorize about and have mystery about how did we get here? What happened in the 6 months? What did Doug Ramsey do with Krakoa while he was there for getting the island ready, right? All these things. You also ask the question, what are the things here in Hickman's work that, kind of in his past work that continue into House and Powers? One of the biggest ones, and probably the most consistent across both his Marvel work and creator-owned stuff, is this idea of the great men coming together and trying to solve everything. For Reed Richards, it's very literally, I'm going to solve everything. New Avengers, you have the Illuminati. If we go on the creator-owned side, on East of West, you have the whole council, the religious, they're not a council, but the religious body that's ruling there, the 12, or not the 12, the prophecy, blah, blah, blah. I'm forgetting the names. Trying to bring about the end of the apocalypse. And here in Mutantdom, you get the exact same thing. You get Professor X and Magneto, and then the greatest retcon of all time, the most interesting sci-fi twist to a character that I mean, maybe I've ever read in comics, with Moira X, taking Moira McTaggart, this fun supporting character, right? Former lover of Charles Xavier, super fun Scottish accent on X-Men the Animated Series, friendly researcher throughout X-Men comics, but a character who died in 2001. Mystique killed her, right? Hasn't been a player with the exception of flashback stuff. And taking her and making her the secret, I've been here all along. I've been reliving lives for 10 lifetimes, and that's my mutant ability. I'm secretly a mutant. No one knew that. And I'm resurrecting and reliving these lives with this knowledge. I mean, just, it opens so many doors. It opens so much possibility. Was such a cool twist. And whether or not it officially works, right? Listen, if you go back and you read some Uncanny X-Men from 1994 and Professor X and Moira are having a conversation about the legacy virus, do they know House and Powers were coming? No, they didn't, right? So you can make it make sense. You can no prize your way to that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The point is this character was an also-ran who became the absolute fulcrum of mutant kind survival into the future. And it made the story about more than being feared and hated on Earth in 2023. It made the story about mutant kind's literal ascension forever, right? And when you're playing that kind of game and you're playing those terms, you're doing something that no other Big Two comic is doing. And you're having a conversation and you're playing with a possibility of story that is unprecedented, I think, in X-Men comics.